You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 Goth Talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. And a very happy Halloween as well. I know it's past Halloween when you're hearing this, but I am recording this on Halloween. And of course, we're Goths, so every day is Halloween. Blessed Samhain to those who celebrate, and from the depths of my heart, I hope you've celebrated and enjoyed this autumnal season. And if you so choose, continue the festivities into the following weeks as well. Why not? I know I will be watching more horror movies and basking in the ambiance as long as I possibly can. But we have an episode to get to, and on this episode, we have Dr. Jordan Soper with us. She's a board-certified behavioral and cognitive psychologist and an ASECT certified sex therapist who owns and operates the Center for Sexual Health and Wellness in Las Vegas. We will be talking about a wide range of topics this time around, including things like whether or not there's a correlation or causal direction between depression and self-harm and goth. And then we're going to have a bunch of sex talk. So we'll explore why the popularization of the kinky goth girlfriend has unnerved so many of us. We'll discuss if goths really do make better lovers, delve into the social lubricant that allows for intersectionality between goth, sex, and death, as well as many other sticky hot topics. Of course, we'll also hear from Azzy Bats at the end of the episode in their segment, All Goth Considered. So as always, I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Let's just start with a little bit of your background. First off, I suppose, with your goth culture background. We can talk a little bit about your academic career as well. But I always like to, understand where and when you discovered goth and, what sort of kept you engaged and connected to that cultural affiliation into your life.
It's a wonderful question. It's also, when we look at the lifespan of a, subculture or something that really links someone, I would say most of us, it's probably when we're very, very young. There's at least some inkling, and mine was probably very consistent. I used to love watching spooky movies. Halloween was always the best, honestly, the best time of year. I used to look at Morticia Addams and be like, I want to look like her. Of course, at such a young age, I'm like, she has dark hair, which is why I'm like obsessed with Deanna Troi from TNG too, because, she has dark hair like me. So I think it probably began in a very young age. I also am from an exceedingly tiny, tiny little town in Southern Nevada, and I was the only, for the most part, larger person in my academic group or my cohort, my age range. And I had grown up with these people since I was 5. Lots of teasing, lots of bullying for lots of different things. The gothicness also was on the table, but there was lots of other things that my peers like to tease me for. So I really have always been into the darker things. This is, I've had the joke when I was growing up, but it kind of grew into this evolution of interest in morbidity, interest in science, interest in architecture, and the history of Halloween. I used to do quote unquote research studies as a child about the Salem witch trials in the US and then in Europe, and just looking at the history of minority groups and subcultures and how we don't talk about things actually increases shame, blame, torture, bullying, and all these very, very terrible things, which when linked with the beauty of goth and gothic culture, it is a beautiful dialectical, which in duality of things that seem to oppose one another, but yet integrate very well. So as a very young kid, I had no idea what the heck all of these things were. As an adult, it has definitely been a bit more congruent and has always felt wonderful. And one of my silly answers is I'm from the desert. I was a very, very large child. Black was the only thing that didn't show my sweat.
Mm-hmm.
And it just becomes like, oh, this feels really good, because you stick me in anything bright and colorful, I get hives. I'm like, oh, this isn't good. I hate it. But that's also probably the residual of living in the desert for such a long time.
And the flip side of that, I suppose, is sort of, did that integrate with your interest in psychology, and why did you have that interest, I suppose? And also, parallel to that, the sort of teasing that you experienced as a child, I wonder if you did get any pushback or run into any barriers in your academic career because of your interests or your presentation, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I was actually initially interested in psychology was because of my love of Deanna Troi. I wanted to be ship's counselor,
Right.
but I was also always the person that loved being the secret keeper, because I was to some degree never fully integrated into any community group because it was such a small town. So people would tell me a lot of things and I wouldn't tell anyone. And I really enjoyed being a confidant, being a support structure for a lot of individuals, and particularly people growing up. Now, this is in the 90s and early 2000s. We didn't have as much internet access as we do now.
Yeah.
I would learn these things. People would write me things, and I would not disclose them. I liked being a support structure. But then as technology evolved, the internet became increased ease of access. Then it was, okay, now how do we share knowledge? How do we spread? And I still really liked being that person. I read a lot of like Dear Abby and people seeking advice. And I really liked that. But due to a lot of the bullying that had gone on, when I first got into psychology, I wanted to work with adolescents who had been bullied, because I wanted them to have a support structure the way that I didn't really have within my peer group. My parents were supportive, but they were very supportive and protective. And when you're an adolescent getting bullied, the last thing you want is a protective parent, because they're going to go down to school and report everything. And that's the last thing you want. So I really liked the idea of having like a therapist or someone in the life. So I initially started working with children who had experienced neglect and trauma and were removed from their homes when I was in undergrad here at UNLV. And doing that, realized I do not want to work with children, because that means I have to work with their parents, who I want to smack in the face. And you can't do that. So my shift kind of went into adult work, and my background, a lot of when people would disclose this information to me, a lot of it would be trauma. People would disclose sexual abuse. They would disclose to me information that ordinarily wasn't discussed. And I think that was what was somewhat attractive to the field, is being a place and being a person that people tell their deepest, darkest secrets to without shame, and know, hey, it's okay, that you're not going to be judged. You're not going to be hurt by this information. I'm not going to use it against you.
Right.
Which was really interesting, because on the other end for me in my academic career, I was always kind of the weirdo. I was very young when I went to graduate school, because I chose an accelerated program in undergrad. So I was done with my bachelor's when I was 20. So I was very young, and I immediately went to a graduate program, and in the middle of Indiana, no less, which was a shift. And in the Midwest, being gothy, being different, walking around wearing, Slipknot hoodies, having dark black hair, always in black, always wearing that, it definitely turned a few heads. And I remember even in the academic career, I had people who I didn't know, but professors, they'd see me and you can tell the up and down look, or all of those wonderful side eyes. And I'll never forget different instances of it, particularly in the Midwest. And we get it pretty much everywhere, but the Midwest was startling, especially because that's the majority of where my academic training began.
Okay.
So it was definitely fun.
I've definitely seen that sentiment expressed by goths throughout my life. That sort of, I know what it's like to be bullied and ostracized, and that experience kind of informs how I treat others and my philosophy on life, because I don't want to perpetuate that harm onto other people. And I think that is a common theme among people I've run into, for sure.
It is. And it makes me happy, because I do see people sometimes going the other direction, where it's escaped from this bullying, but now I want to perpetuate it on others because it gives me an opportunity to vent. And I like that at least the people I've encountered and interacted with within the goth scene tend to take the former tack of, I experienced this. I want to save others from that experience. I want to be that shoulder, that support structure for people to go to escape from that situation.
Mm-hmm. It's to some degree, I've noticed it being a way to break cycles related to intergenerational violence, even if it's not within the same family structure. We're looking at like different time points and social structures. It's a way to break that, particularly because I think some subgroups and minority groups have been ostracized and bullied and traumatized at even in a higher rate than others. And dependent upon the timelines, I think the more we can say, hey, this isn't okay. I realize this wasn't okay. Here is why. And understanding why these things happened in the first place, I think gives you a lot of power and resilience to not perpetuate or not fall into those same patterns.
Yeah. And I think the subculture also has an embrace of the concept of found family. That might help break that as well, because the intergenerational propagation is familial, but if you choose a new family that doesn't encourage that or doesn't have those same baselines and gives you a new role model that's still considered familial, it might be a little bit more powerful than just a social group.
And I found that even in like different musical group, like music communities, the geek culture to some degree. I'm a big metalhead. I used to follow Slipknot around when I was in the Midwest for such a long time. So many concerts. Like I was a metalhead too. So that integration of like, I present very gothic, but I'm very into metal, and I used to do that. And being a woman too, it was like just layer. And that was where I found a lot of community. I was a larger person too. I'm 5'10", and I think I was at my largest, I was like 320 pounds. So I was very, like, I took up a lot of space, and I had to learn how to take up space to look different. And the things that I chose voluntarily to look different, and my choices in that. So like how to take up ownership and be assertive. That took a long time to be comfortable with.
I kind of on that theme, I do want to talk a lot about sex and romance in this episode, but I thought, considering that, your background being a psychologist, I felt I couldn't miss the opportunity to ask your opinion about mental health as it relates to goth, because there's obviously that stereotypical association with goths being depressed, and that kind of cultural association of death and darkness with sadness, and kind of linking that to the presentation of goths. And there's even been some academic studies that have tried to explore that connection. The most recent one, as far as I know, was that 2015 survey-based study that kind of made the claim that goths have a higher likelihood to be depressed or self-harm than their it was like teenagers, like 15, I believe their age was.
It was a whole cohort, sorry, where
15 to 18.
They took 15, and then I think it did the initial test for some social issues at 15, and then the actual depression and self-harm metric was at 18.
Yeah.
And they did some sort of an analysis of the delta.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about that, sort of what your opinion is on whether or not goths are more prone to be depressed or self-harm than other groups, and that sort of mental health aspect of it.
I think it's a beautiful question. And I was reading the article and kind of understanding a little bit where they're coming from, which again is adolescence. And this is where we run into these really fun psychometric issues, and how we take data and translate it to the general population is like, we know that adolescents during that developmental cycle are going to have higher rates of self-harm, higher rates of depression, due to a number of factors, looking at what we call psychosocial stressors. So like in school environments, what's their access to resource, one about familial violence and all, and bullying and all these things. And we do know that individuals in minority groups, subcultures experience higher rates of bullying, which we know is increased rates of trauma exposure later subsequent. So that's where we're kind of running into a lot of struggle with most psychology articles and research studies is, correlation versus causation. So the idea that these individuals, that Goths have increased rates of self-harm, depression, mental illness because they're Goth, or is it that they are experiencing increased rates of violence, increased rates of distress, which is then leading to that because they identify as part of a subculture? It's chicken and egg is kind of what we run into. But what we do know is that individuals, particularly like young Goths, are what we know. And I have not done too much adolescent work. I do a lot of young adult, but not too much adolescent work anymore. Is we do see that individuals, when they are exposed to violence from their peers, bullying, ostracization, those are going to be increased risk factors, not necessarily the specific subculture, which I think gets a kind of Goth gets a very bad rap because of this affiliation, this assumption that it's affiliated with death and destruction and morbidity, when actually being exposed and understanding and not fearing some of those topics actually decreases the likelihood that a person is actually going to engage in suicide or self-harm patterns of behavior and has increased resiliency if they lose a family member or are exposed to a traumatic event. So it's a little bit of during our adolescence. I don't think that Gothic adolescents, because they are Goth, are at increased risk. I think because they likely experience other factors that would likely increase it more than anything. I don't think the Goth is what does it.
One thing that I was thinking of pretty heavily while reading this article as well is there was no mention of a concept of survivorship bias. So, I mean, there's a possibility that those who didn't proceed with the study may have taken their life or been unable to answer for any number of reasons. And the question there is, sure, the depression, the suicidal thoughts are indicators of potential risk of suicide, but they're obviously studying and only getting data from people who did not do that last step. So is it possible that interaction with the Goth subculture didn't turn off those tendencies, those urges or whatever, but did prevent them from taking that final and irreversible step to actual suicide?
Yeah, and I go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
You go. You're the guest. You speak.
Well, I think it's such a beautiful component that we do need to be able to look at is what are the overall rates of suicide attempts? What are the context variables associated with it? And especially with a lot of these analyses, they're self-report. So people are identifying themselves. They are running into an issue of like how they are identifying subcultures. Like even in here, the procedures, the peer crowd questionnaire is putting people into social groups of sporty, populars, chavs, keeners, bimbos, and goths. And I'm like, well, again, it's UK, the kind of based analysis, what's going on. But it's how do people identify? I'm someone who's always identified as Goth, but I describe myself as like a gothy, nerdy person. I was a metalhead. I was I was not sporty because, but I was okay with that. I was still a loner, but I had friends. So it's like, how does a person self-identify is going to throw in a huge wrench into this too, where when we look at being accepted, fuck all how you identify, if you feel supported, do you feel like you have a community? Do you feel like you have a space to be heard? That's going to be a significantly more protective factor than whatever group you identify with. And same when we look at suicide, risk factors for suicide are more about perception of burdensomeness or perception of isolation or a view of foreshortened future. And I think that's actually when I'm going to get very, very philosophical when I say this, I think it actually could sometimes deter individuals who identify as Gothic for completion of suicide, because they think about things when we look at the linearity and the historical aspect of the culture and how long Goths have been around, and looking at Gothic literature and Gothic fashion and architecture, like we ain't going anywhere. And that perception of community and future can actually be a protective factor to suicide.
Yeah, you made so many good points there. I like, I do think there is a kind of predisposition of, as you brought up, Goths leaning into exploring existential and ontological areas of life and questions, and that sort of creating a resiliency and creating an honesty about depression and suicidal ideation and that kind of thing. Because I do, another point to this is that I think the mental health issue is still stigmatized, maybe especially among children, and sort of hiding that from parents and adults. And so the survey, sort of being a survey question, assumes an honesty of reporting.
Right.
And I do think that Goths, at least from my own anecdotal like high school experience, I think we are more willing to have an open discussion about how we feel and sort of the causes and conditions of depression and anxiety. And that there's also a sort of, I guess, to your point, the a built-in categorization in the questions, because there is that fluidity across social boundaries and communities. We just talked recently about Goths in England who are on football teams. So it's like, there's that blending of interests and diversity of proclivities and hobbies and that kind of thing.
You have the wonderful intersectionality of it. It's not just one thing anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And what was the other thing you said about being cautious about extrapolating findings across communities? Because if you looked at, if you just limited it to like one city and looked at specific groups of people and compared them against each other, you'd get very different results than what you did here. And with, because it's the questions were like, have you ever self-harmed? And then how do you identify, basically? But it didn't look at, when did the self-harm happen? Was it before you were a Goth, after you were a Goth? What, like you were saying, what's going on in your life? Were you, what were your living conditions? What are your interests? Were you subjected to trauma? That kind of thing. So I don't like that, creating this sort of, association across time and place and groups for this universal like connection either. I think it's very fluid and contextual as well.
Oh, very much so. And also it's what we run into such a big issue, especially with, scientific studies. And this goes for many. You're looking at your sample size. Where did they come from? Were the participants paid to do it? Were they volunteer? Were they self-selective? It's psychometric analysis is one of the most fascinating things about our field. I don't do a lot of research, but I always enjoyed that, mostly because I don't like writing. I don't like writing these kinds of articles. Anyone who does read this article, you're like, oh my God, this is boring. I'm like, yeah, it's clinical writing. It's, it's research writing. It's boring as hell. But the psychometrics and test construction and research construction and context is so cool because it really highlights the diversity and the expansion of humans. That there's so much intersectionality, there's so much contextual variable and so much connection and conceptualization to be made about each individual person. How do we take those very individualistic concepts and translate them to overall patterns or common patterns?
Yeah.
With caveats built in every step of the way.
All right.
Well, before we move on, another problem I guess I had with the methodology is the fact that they ended at 18. And I think there's a lot of richness to be had since, the mind is still developing at least into your mid 20s. And a lot of the stuff that is being developed is around the impulse control and stuff like that, which directly counteracts things like physical self-harm and suicidal ideation when your mind can actually start to grapple with that more productively or constructively or as it develops. So having a follow-up study to this, I mean, this was in 2015, it's 2023 now, we could have one 8 years afterwards, and we're now getting into the 26-year-old range, which is when the brain is either fully developed or pretty close to fully developed to an adult brain size. And it would be interesting. I know.
We don't.
But as a rough metric, the fact that we do know there's some continuing development that happens, and adolescence is bad for just struggling with these sort of things because you're just coming to grips with being human at that point.
Well, you're also and as it relates a little bit to that, you're looking at, I'll kind of say my clinical words in this, like impulse control and emotion regulation. How much of it is also just an absence of skill, exposure to which modalities are going to be the most effective for yourself, and like what happens. Like I was someone who I never engaged in self-harm. It was never something that was there. I was more of an, like, if you can phrase it, like emotional self-harm and, you know, food-based self-harm, but I never cut. It was never something that I was like, oh, that doesn't sit well for me. It never did it. But I definitely harmed myself in other ways because there was an absence of insight and emotion regulation and insight, impulse control for a lot of individuals. It's why we see increased rates at certain ages, which we do expect. And simultaneously, what are protective factors to deter those things? And that's where that combination of impulse control, frontal lobe development in conjunction with community support and having people acknowledge and validate those balance very well with each other. And I think that's where people who do identify in the Gothic subculture a bit of, they find that community, they find people who they can talk to about these things, which actually ends up then decreasing the engagement in the activity because they learn to soothe in a different way.
Right.
It's again, it's a dance. It's that beautiful, beautiful dance because there's a very big difference between someone who identifies as Gothic in an isolatory standpoint versus a community standpoint.
Right. Yeah. No, those are wonderful insights. I love that. But since I have no good pivot, we're going to talk about sex now. So let's do that.
Impulse control. I got you. Impulse control and sexual functioning. There you go.
And coping mechanisms too. Not in a healthy way necessarily, but is a coping mechanism. And there was the bimbos group.
I love how they identify that because they're using like British slang, like the British slang. And I'm like, oh, y'all, people identify that as so much. I love British shows. Like I grew up on British literature and entertainment. I'm like, yep. All I have is like from Doctor Who, I'm a chav. And I had to Google what a chav was because it was like 2005. I'm like, what the fuck?
I think I heard of that from like EastEnders was the show that I've never actually watched it, but I heard it discussed when discussing EastEnders. So that's how I learned chav.
So in thinking about sex, we'll get back to that, sex relationships, the first thing that came to my mind was this I guess well-known, kind of infamous is how I would describe it, documentary from 2003, again going back to England, that was called Goths Make Better Lovers. And the argument in that primarily was the Goths are doing something right because they're always in long-term relationships. So I think there's a lot to say about the documentary, but I wanted to ask sort of if you think there are any aspects of Goth culture that might make Goths better partners or lovers, and beyond that, sort of what are some guiding principles to being a good lover?
I love this question, and I remember watching the documentary in 2003 when I was much younger than I am now. I remember it and being like, but as an adult, I think, and this might sound like a silly answer, one of the reasons I think Goths may make better lovers is we actually have one of the best examples of healthy relationships in all of media I've ever seen in Gomez and Morticia. They are my and I mean like Angelica Houston, like she is my like era of that, but they are such a healthy example of communication, passion, eroticism without being overtly sexualized. And I really enjoy them. So I think my initial answer is yes, if you kind of go, we have a really good model for it, unlike other mainstream examples. But as far as define goth, define better, define lover, and that we just get into the entire component of it. But it's also, there's this cultural assumption that a long-term relationship means a healthy relationship. And that, I think, is like one of the biggest pitfalls of a lot of these things, is the assumption that the longer you've been together, that somehow equates to like an achievement unlock and going, see, we've been together for 30 years. We're healthy, right? No. And I've also seen relationships that are brand new that have exceedingly high levels of health in what we define as good and positive and functional relationships. So a lot of issues.
Yeah.
not just issues, but like lots of concepts of how do we even define these terms first?
Right. Well, there's that sort of oddly, I think in goth communities that I've been in, there is that association of serial monogamy, I guess, as being a metric by which you measure how valuable you are as a partner, despite the sort of association of goth with deviance to cultural norms. There's still a very kind of heteronormative expectation of monogamy. But I do think there is at least a less of a stigma against non-monogamous relationships. But it is interesting to me how that sort of cultural norm, broader cultural norm, is married to goth relationships. Well, I guess with any community, goths have a built-in commonalities, right? You can share your clothes regardless of your gender. You like similar music. You usually there's like a political or philosophical alignment among most goths, and there's the sort of goth is very visual, so you have a eclectic play with appearance that can create a sort of sex appeal down the line, I guess. Although I guess some people will say, like, don't get into a relationship for how somebody looks, because as you age, that changes. But I think if that's important to you, I think goths kind of carry a sense of style later into their life. So then you're not like fucking a guy who just cycles through 5 different colors of polo shirt and a pair of jeans, right? So there's that creativity aspect to goth that I think can make those relationships more interesting.
I think I'll like piggyback on that, because there's a certain degree of what I would describe as like authenticity and genuineness that really comes with it, particularly if like appearance or even philosophical perspective or values an individual who has done that level of self-exploration versus someone who's just like piecemealing parts of it and going like, oh, this is pretty. Because I think you can really be attracted to aspects of goth culture and be gothy or gothic in certain ways without it being this singularity. And I think individuals who have done some of that self-exploration go, this feels value congruent to me. That's actually what makes it attractive to a potential partner or partners. And then that level of congruence and genuineness and insight oriented and awareness of self and others, those are the mechanisms that are going to make them good lovers or good in romantic relationships, because there is almost a metacognition about self, others, and the world. And I think that's the mechanism of action that would increase the likelihood, which we'll see in other subgroups as well, in other subcultures. And we see the absence of it in others too. Highly religious environments.
Yeah, I think
I'm very biased.
And Danny, I think you pointed out something important with the shared interest and shared activities aspect of things, because goth is, at least in my experience, it doesn't really have as much of a gendered distinction as to what the members are interested in and what activities they participate in. So you have more overlap in a heteronormative relationship, at least, with, the male and the female in the relationship are more likely to have an overlapping group of activities, oftentimes an overlapping group of friends as well. So you're doing a lot of things together rather than the stereotypical, as portrayed in pop culture, idea of, the man in the relationship goes and hangs out with his guy friends at a bar, and the woman goes to the bridge club or, something like that. They have these very separate activities for the woman and the man in the relationship, and they come together less frequently, or they do like special things together. They have date nights and stuff like that. Whereas when you have that much more closely enmeshed social circle and activities, you're doing a lot more things together and enjoying them, not feeling like you're being pressured. Oh, I have to spend, I have to go to the game with my husband. Oh, I have to go to the theater with my wife, to go totally stereotypical.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that.
There is that sort of feeling, and I've listened to this just talking to coworkers who are just in regular, relationships, struggling or being frustrated or being annoyed by having to do this thing with their partner that they're not interested in. And
I always laugh at that. Like, do you even like who you're the person you're married to?
Exactly.
Oh yeah. And Trey, that's like, it's such an important part, because then we're going to get into these like a bigger, like socio cultural, like macro issues. And this is like one of my big passion project. Like this is one of my big passions, is the way in which we socialize persons at different developmental cycles and different ages perpetuates throughout life. And I'm someone who's very much like, especially the way that we raise boys and girls and the views of gender, and gender as a social construct, and that we can and cannot do things, and like emotional awareness of our young boys, and like the emotional support, and the idea of how those messages about gender, what is right, what is wrong, how those perpetuate all persons, regardless of sex or gender or sexual orientation. And this relates to like sexual practice. The amount of men that I work with, because I spent most of my training in the VA. So I have spent the majority of my time working with the people who identify as male. The amount of men that say, I just want her to hug me. I just want to be little spoon. And how that is like not socially acceptable, and the shame that it causes. And I think in romantic relationships, the idea of, if we can identify, challenge, and modify some of that old coding, we'll see people engage in similar activities, or maybe non-genderified activities, or change the perception of gentrification of experiences. And I think that is the mechanism of change that a lot in goth culture, we do see that already occurring, which is what makes it beautiful. Like this, again, Gomez is such a beautiful example of this. You see his passion, his vulnerability, his love, and you see her responding in a non-shaming way. You see her allowing him to be masculine, but then she doms him in this beautiful, beautiful tango that they do. It's why there's such a beautiful example of healthy relationships.
Something else that came up in that documentary was the perception of goths as sexual beings by outsiders. And I think, you have a fairly well-known association with goth and the BDSM community, sort of because they've shared spaces. Goths have kind of taken aesthetics from that community and modified it for their own sartorial practices. And
it's also an avenue for moderated self-harm. And potentially healthy outlets for that as well.
Yeah. And so historically you have goths who are into BDSM and BDSM practitioners who can be goth. And there is this sort of pop culture conflation of the two that's sort of been exacerbated by memes, the like big titty goth girlfriend memes and that kind of thing. And so then in response to this, the last couple years, I've seen a lot of goths take to me, it seems like an almost puritanical stance, saying that goths shouldn't be openly sexual or be sex workers or any that kind of stuff, because it perpetuates that association of goth with sexual deviance. So I wanted to ask how you sort of see that relationship, and how we can respond to that stereotype, that kind of sexism that we see.
Well, it's such a kind of integrated conversation, because you're looking again at that notion of intersectionality. If there was a word to describe a lot of what we're talking about, it is that word, because the Gothic subculture, you're looking at the BDSM subculture, you're looking at the LGBTQ plus subculture, and how like these groups have really shared spaces, because it was only the safe place to exist. Like it was the safest place for these individuals to exist. And the idea that goth, BDSM are correlate or have that high level of correlation, you're going to run into a major issue, is the fact that the BDSM and kink community is actually significantly more common even in mainstream than people really discuss. And that's like, I have such a rage against 50 Shades of Grey, because it's inappropriate and incorrect BDSM.
Oh God.
And
no.
This is terrible.
Yes.
And simultaneously, it brought to the mainstream culture what has kind of really been there for a long time, which is people have an interest in sexual exploration. People have an interest in role play. People have an interest in expressing themselves in different ways. And that, I think, is what has been perpetuating more of that intersectionality is a space and a peoples that you can express yourself with versus a shame and an avoidance of it. And like, there's a reason we have a trope and a meme of all of these Republican and conservative politicians ending up at the bottom of a dom's floor or engaging in these things that they really do not talk about.
All the scandals always happen.
All the scandals happen for a reason, because the more we shame these things, the worse it is. And that's kind of where I run into an issue with the sexism shift, is it's still maintained by shame, which is don't be the big titty goth girl, or don't do this, or don't do that. It's like, it's still come from a place of shame versus, hey, that's not my thing. Good on you. Here's some other ways to be goth. Here is how I do it, and being able to talk about it. So it's still motivated by shame. And I'm like, can we not do that? Versus, hey, don't yuck other people's yums at the very, very core, because that's what we've been telling people to do for such a long time of, hey, you do you. That ain't mine, but I enjoy that you enjoy it, and leaving it at that.
Yeah, I guess I can echo that. What you said, because it comes up in that documentary, but it's a completely different tact, weirdly, because they sort of argue that because goth fashion is inherently sexy, and it's the kind of thing that people wear on their honeymoons, then that perception of goths as more experimental in the bedroom is actually good, because it means we're the sort of enlightened beings to be coveted. And whereas now I think some people want to push back against the perception of goths being sexualized because of that stereotype is sort of like the goth girlfriend as kind of property to be traded. Whereas when I was getting into goth, there was always just sort of that tacit acknowledgement of the element of sexuality among goths and all degrees and varieties of sexual experimentation or lack thereof. And I think people are just sort of like last week I saw a TikTok where this guy was singing about how, kind of what you were saying, he wanted a goth girl to degrade him because it turned him on. And I've seen a few different people make songs like that. And I think people are just experiencing a fatigue of these sexist, aggressive men. But like, to your point, I think that is the problem, is not doing this sort of like victim blaming thing, where the issue is that the men are treating women as sexual objects instead of people. And we should be calling those people out and kicking them out of our spaces rather than blaming the victims, I guess, because there is that spectrum of, maybe some people can only come if they're like tied up and bleeding, but you have goths who are asexual, you have goths who are just into what may be perceived as like vanilla sexual relationships. And I think saying like, well, non-goths shouldn't wear bondage gear during sex because they're cosplaying goths, or goths shouldn't wear latex and straps because we're going to be perceived as an entire group of people that are sexual. I think we should have that degree of fluidity where we're allowing people to express themselves and associate their sexual identities as they want to, rather than trying to stop it, to control it, to contain it.
Right.
Precisely. Because this is why I'm so vocal about sex. Sex is ingrained in humanity. We are sexual creatures from birth to death. And the idea that your sexual identity and your sexuality is actually omnipresent, regardless of your background, regardless of your subculture or your mainstream culture or your interests or any things, your sexual identity is as ingrained in you as eating, pooping, and sleeping is. And the more we kind of come to that perspective, then we're able to go, hey, why do you want the big titty goth girl to step on you? Oh, is it because that's a form of you feel cared for and you don't know how better way of being able to say that that's how you want it? Are you into the mommy dom because of that? Are you actually wanting someone to cause you pain that feels very pleasurable because of the level of impact that it causes to your skin because you have nerve damage in other places. And that's the only way you can get that. And it feels that way. Like being able to really just highlight that your sexual identity is always there. And then the moment we shame it, now we've just perpetuated the problem even more. Then that is, I think, where we run into such a big struggle of, no, do it this way. No, this is the right way to do it. Motherfucker, as long as everyone is consenting, everyone is actually like openly and enthusiastically consenting and above the age of 18, I do not give a flying fuck what you're doing. As long as it's not hurting others. And that's it's that gatekeeping within community versus between groups. And that I have such an issue with gatekeeping between groups and within groups because it's this idea of, no, there's a right way. No, there's not. There's a couple wrong ways to do things, but the majority of everything else is pretty appropriate.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the concept of policing within an in-group is usually much more stringent in a lot of cases, for better or for worse. We're very protective of our group. And a lot of that is bundled with our individual concept of what our group is, and what doesn't conform to that. It's hard to let go sometimes for most people.
Well, it's also then you run into the concern of like with individuals who identify as, with different mental health conditions or who process information differently. It's being able to increase cognitive flexibility versus rigidity, which is a lifelong skill.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the other part of that was interesting to me was the porn thing, which I wanted to ask you about, because the idea and I've seen this over the years as well. I've had people actually stop following the podcast because they were upset about this, but the idea that, sex workers there's inherently something wrong with that, or inherently something oppressive about that, or exploitative about that, and that there isn't ethical porn, or in this specific situation, it's like, well, if you're goth and a sex worker, then you're performing for the male gaze or something. And I think like we could look at other communities like the queer owned porn companies that, and talk about that sort of thing. But I was interested in what your perspective on the ethics of porn is, I guess.
Oh, I love this question because it's one of those ones, and I cannot talk about it on TikTok because they take my fucking videos down. I'm not bitter and angry at all. It's fine. Fine. I view porn, I identify as porn neutral, similar to how I identify as like water neutral. So when I say this, water is wonderful and beautiful. It's stunning to look at. We need water to survive. I need you drinking water. If you haven't drank water today, please drink some water, because you're basically a houseplant with more complicated emotions. So please feed your plant. And we have tsunamis, and you can drown, and it can kill you. Porn is very equivalent. I think it is a very beautiful space that can be used for good in order to show diverse bodies and be able to show what differently abled bodies or differently looked bodies engages in sex. You can have sex education videos. I think it's a way for couples and individuals to explore different aspects of humanity and sexuality. And I wish that we had increased rights to sex workers. I wish the industry actually had ways to protect them more in different ways. And I think people who don't use it to the best of its ability can drown in it. And I think that's what makes it such a complicated topic, is because it is basically Schrodinger's porn. It is both simultaneously good and bad at the same time.
Yeah. And the more it's stigmatized, the more it's then sidelined, which leads to more of those sort of, it leaves it a space that's open to the abuse because it's something that we're not paying attention to. So we can't call out the abuse. We can't stop the abuse. And once something is to a black market, it automatically starts going into all different directions that can be societally harmful. But it's not the problem of the act or activity itself. It's a problem of just society's disregard for that whole community and that whole activity that lets bad actors potentially flourish and causes potential good actors to suffer.
Well, it sounds a lot like the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Bazinga. Yeah.
I love Spotlight. Spotlight's one of my favorite films of all time, and it just highlights that exact thing of it's the act, the things that are going on is very different than the social perception and the behind the scenes imbalance of power and control. And at its very core, that's where we're looking at regulation and accountability and how these things change. And we see this, unfortunately, in many, many different subcultures and groups and any organization when you have people involved and hierarchies associated with it. We're going to run into those struggles and like, what is the accountability of all of that?
Well, it's interestingly, I've seen some behind the scenes videos from these, I guess you would call them ethical porn companies, where before they do a scene, they have all the actors and the direct, or the camera crew and everybody there, and the actors go over like what's going to happen, what are you comfortable and consensual with, what are, set your boundaries, and then you have like they're paid for what they do, and they have some creative control over the stories and like scenes that are happening, whereas, and that stuff is usually like websites you pay for, and I think a lot of the porn people think of are like the free sites where there is rampant exploitation of the women and the people, the queer people in those community, where like the queer thing, usually you think of like lesbians or trans people that are used for like the cis male gaze, rather than those people creating their own, doing what they want to do. And like OnlyFans has its problems, but it does empower people to have control over what they're doing, which I think is good. And
that's the whole amateur porn industry that rose with the internet, where people were just able to post their own homemade stuff.
Yeah.
Well, it's getting into, and this is something I feel very passionate about, and not just with porn, but in sex in general, identify what is the motivation behind the action. Like what motivates us to do the things that we do. So same with like the porn world. What is motivating you to consume the porn? What are you hoping to gain from it? What is motivating you to engage in the porn action, to be a performer? What aspects of it? What is motivating you to do certain things? Where do you feel like your lines are not able to say certain things, and being able to look at what's going on? And there's multiple documentaries about the porn industry, particularly here in the US, like When Porn Ends, Hot Girls Wanted, and being able to look at like how porn is a multi-billion dollar industry, and it's not going to go anywhere, which I think is honestly awesome. And how can we make it the most healthy that it possibly can be? For not just the performers, but the directors and the sound crew. Are they unionized? Do they have days off? What's the medical crew looking like? How do we talk about paying people appropriately? How do we talk about people who are consuming it? How do we not shame people for wanting to watch porn? What's their different gaze of the idea of I'm interested in it versus I'm interested in this parasocial relationship with this person? And it's just so multifaceted. And I think there's more and more ways we can talk about it. I mean, even with like celebrities, like looking what's going on right now with Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake, and the way that we talk about all of this stuff, it's kind of hard not to pay attention to. People want to talk about stuff, and it's what's the space and what's the structure in which we are talking about it. Is it from a place of openness and curiosity versus shame and rigidity?
Yeah. Well, and I would think you would, great points as well. I totally agree. And I think I would assume you've run into situations where you have, because you've done videos on misconceptions around sex and that kind of thing. And I think sometimes because there is that shame around sexuality, that people learn about sex through porn and these like contrived situations, and then end up with these misconceptions about what their bodies and their sexualities are like. I don't know if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yes. Well, and that's why I, at least personally and professionally, talk about sex as much as I do. I don't really talk too much about my sex life within that, but I'll do talk about normative experiences, which is where porn served the need that no one else really was, which was sex ed. The majority of us, that's where our sex ed came from. So, but no one really sat down and said, hey, this is actually how porn gets made. This is the behind the scenes. This is how many cuts. This is how you have to stretch in order to do that position. Here is what anal training is like. And that's something that I like to discuss, because even within general,
I love talking about anal training.
It's really just a fun conversation. I love it personally. I'm like, please train the anus, because it can do awesome things too. But we don't really talk about that in general culture of like, hey, during sex, things are going to smell. You're going to make really weird noises. Here's what queefing is. Like, here is how deep into the vaginal canal you can get. Or, hey, do you know that you can have sex without penetrating anything?
Yes.
We don't have a space for that. That's very normalized. And that's where I think different sex advocates and sex researchers like Dr. Ruth or Dr. Sue Johnson, or even like getting more and more people to talk about it in a normalizing way. However, then we deal with, well, what makes that person trained and skilled? And do we have increased access to those individuals? Are they getting, blocked on social media talking about these things? What's their credibility? Like, there's the whole like no fat movement went along. And I'm like, actually, orgasm is really great if you have a prostate, because it reduces your risk of prostate cancer by a shitload. Please masturbate. And taking from that like normalized perspective, but we don't do that. And that's where the more and more we can set up a space to talk about it, that actually is our sex education, to go, hey, here is actually what this is like. This is where you're going to get cramps. When if you don't get in this position, this is a person is actually holding another person up by the buttocks and you just can't see them off camera. No one looks like that. Like, even with like VR porn and what we've seen that shift into, like the HD cameras that are getting utilized, being able to say, hey, this is the special effects makeup that is going on that person. Here is why they look so flawless. I'm like, welcome to the magic of makeup. And just really pulling the curtain back and going, oh, that's what's going on. Yeah, that's actually what's going on. And just that quick insight will do wonders for a person's view of themselves, their body, their partner's ability. That's going to change a lot of stuff. Which has been what my favorite thing to do in therapy is, by the way. I love talking about sex in treatment, because it's actually normalizing those things, having conversations with patients of like, hey, here's how you stretch, or I need you to try this position. Or if you're masturbating, can you maybe try sitting up versus laying down, dependent upon your circulatory issue? And that really, those tiny mechanisms are really what will change the whole thing. And even, podcasts like this and talking about it. Asking a person of like, what was the last time you masturbated? Or can I ask you a question? When was the last time you masturbated? And asking consent and just saying the word masturbate or saying the word sex. That'll do a lot of things to it. It's why I named my practice the Center for Sexual Health and Wellness. And my father's immediate response was, why did you name it that? You're going to attract the weirdos. And I said, that's the point. My weirdos are me. Like, I want my weirdos because we're all a little weird. My dad is also very open within that. It was just a funny moment. I'm like, that's kind of the point. So that's the point.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, speaking to that, the weirdos, I do, one of the things I was thinking about is how there is an openness in the goth community to talk about goths who have like autism or depression, like we talked about, or ADHD. Sort of the people that fall under the term I don't like, but the neurodivergent thing. And so I wanted to ask where there are some maybe challenges or differences or nuances to being sexual and intimate if you do have some sort of neurodivergence.
It's a wonderful, wonderful question. And we have more and more research and more clinical trainings in our side of the house that is talking about like working with like neurospicy persons or people who have different mental health concerns. How do we do that? It's going to depend upon the person, but you're looking at overall patterns. So typically for people who maybe identify as neurospicy, there's a lot of rigidity, or there's like sensory processing concerns, or there's an absence of understanding. So that's where I'm such a huge advocate of slow it down a little bit, of like, well, what definitions are you using? What different terms are you using? Well, how's your body reacting in those different moments? And by doing that, you're actually going to increase awareness. And by increasing awareness, we increase the option for persons to enthusiastically consent to situations. So that's where more and more of these conversations about what is going on We also do know that individuals who identify as experiencing mental illness and mental health concerns are at increased risks of being taken advantage of, are increased risks of being survivors of violence. So that's why I do encourage everyone to have more and more of these conversations, because then it's going to increase awareness of, hey, here are the things to be aware of to keep yourself as safe as you possibly can. And especially in sexual experiences where someone they may genuinely not understand something. That's not a failure on their part. And it may not mean that they don't want to engage in those actions. They just may not actually know.
Right.
Right. And that also, some of that just reemphasizes something you asked at the very beginning of this conversation when we started talking about the sex, and we were talking about that Goth documentary. You were talking about, well, we need to actually define what is a good lover. And the problem with that concept is this generalized popular idea of a good lover is someone who learns a specific set of skills, but those are concrete skills that are universally applicable across the board.
They're Liam Neeson. Take it. We have a set of skills.
Right, exactly. But this idea that you can learn certain techniques. I've got a bag of butt
plugs and I'm not afraid to use them. I'm sorry.
It's all right. But this idea that there are these certain skills you can learn that will drive, the Cosmo plague of 7 things to drive your man wild, to drive your woman wild. The problem is
you've hit her trigger word.
Right. There isn't this concept of a universal skill. If you do oral sex or penetration in this specific way, it'll always work. There's no such thing as a good lover in the abstract. You can be a good lover for this other person. And the important thing, as you were just talking about, Jordan, was the idea that the communication. You need to learn. You need to do that slow workup to learn what works, what doesn't work with any time you have a new partner. When you're exploring sex with a new person, yes, you can take what you've learned with other people as ideas and starting points, but you cannot take them as assumptions. What worked for one person may be actually damaging to another person. Or at the least a major turnoff. So you need to be doing that slow, understanding, feeling out the situation, being very aware from as many senses as possible of how they're responding to whatever interactions you're having, and then how you're responding to theirs, because that's how you are teaching them, how you're communicating to the other partner. I like this, I don't like this. And that's one of those harms that's often talked about in porn, is when someone thinks, well, I have to respond this way because that's the expected thing. But that's oftentimes can be giving mixed signals too.
And I'll agree with that. And then I'll add in a caveat. I think the definition of a good lover, and I will say this till I die, the thing that makes you a good lover is communication with your partner. And that at its core, I don't care how skilled you are. I don't care how well you can eat a pussy out. It doesn't give a shit. It's a matter of how good of a communicator you are, because your most vital sex organ is your brain. And to be able to have that level of communication of your needs, your questions, what do you want your partner to have? And this goes not just new partners, this is partners you've been with for years and years and years and decades. We find that increased transparency and communication of needs is the number one leading cause, is the number one mechanism that keeps partners together. That will always be the mechanism of action, is increased transparency and communication. Those are the things that will keep people together. And when it comes to sexual functioning, no sexual encounter, even if it's with the same person, is ever the same. Because what did you eat that day? What time of day is it? What day of the week is it? Is the dog in the room or out of the room? It's a quantum physics question of no sexual
encounter.
Why is the dog
staring at my butthole?
Because it looks like theirs. They're like, is that what I look like?
You can never step into the same sexual encounter twice.
Yes, it literally is quantum physics at its very, very core. And the more we talk about those experiences, the more it normalizes it. And that normalization is what decreases our anxiety, our fear, our avoidance, our shame, and all of those unhelpful obstacles to sex.
Well, speaking of the day you die, there's my transition. Being a podcast about goth, we have talked a lot about the relationship of death to goth and all of the stuff around that, but never really the relationship of death and dying to sex. And So I guess I won't quantify that at all. I'll just ask you what's your experience with that subject, and how does sex relate to those things?
And I love this question because it is something that, and I think I echoed it a little earlier, the idea of we are sexual creatures from birth to death. We know we have ultrasounds that show fetuses masturbating in utero because it's equivalent to us like sticking a Q-tip in our ear and going, I found the spot. That's all it is.
Yeah.
Same with death. And the idea that your sexuality, it doesn't turn off just because you grow older. It doesn't mean sexuality isn't a part or a question if you're going through cancer treatments. Like your sexual functioning and your identity is still there. And that's where I think, because death is a taboo, sex is a taboo, fuck all, life is a taboo at this point with people talking about it. If we can actually discuss it and go, hey, this is something that does happen, either when we lose partners, or maybe if we're losing someone we care about, how grief and death might make us more horny because it's the shortness of life. There's a reason we saw a little bit of a baby boom during COVID. I'm like, yeah, because people thought they were like going to die. And they're like, that's the reason they were like doing that. And it's like, well, we're kind of stuck in a room. I guess we'll fuck. And I'm like, that's why. Yeah. Or why we saw increased rates of separation and divorce during the pandemic, because it was like, you mean I'm going to go through a major like stressor with you and a potential zombie apocalypse? Leave. So death itself is at its very generalization, the death for the living is a reminder of life and death simultaneously existing. And sex is ingrained in that, and how we have those conversations about grief and loss and death, it is related to sex. We're not talking about necrophilia in this way. We're talking about the humanity and the life that is left after death, and your sex is still a part of that.
Yeah. And I like, to your earlier point, the way that sex can function as a sort of healing or intimacy that's missing, or an escape and that kind of thing, that those don't go away when you are grieving, or when you are dying or have an illness or something like that. You know, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this question as this has come up, this sort of concept of how we are all sexual creatures. And I had this question because there is a contingent of Goths who are asexual or gray sexual. Trey, you've talked about this before. And so
I do consider myself mostly gray sexual.
And there's an assumption of like, these people are repulsed, I guess, by sex or something like that. So where does sex fit into that way of being? Yeah.
Oh, yes. For people who are asexual, gray sexual, it's the thing I love to say about these individuals when we have conversations is there's an absence of distress. A person who identifies as asexual is not distressed by their absence of interest in sex. It feels value congruent. And that, even right there, is still a part of your sexual identity to go, this really isn't my thing, and I'm okay with that. And you feel that calmness that kind of comes with it over time once a person maybe has had a space to explore that.
Yeah, I'm going to say that's not the experience with early
stage
experience, because you're getting bombarded by societal pressures and you're being viewed as a freak when you're not responding in a way you're expected to, especially as a man.
To the idea of performative, and that's what your identity means. And that's why being able to have that self-exploration to go, even the absence of sexual actions, it doesn't mean you're not sexual. If you are human, you are a sexual being. It's a matter of your practice. And for a person who identifies as asexual, there isn't there is almost incongruence if there's actions going on. Now, there can still be intimacy. Intimacy isn't just sex. You're talking about maybe wanting to touch or cuddle, or individuals can still have very fulfilling romantic relationships. Sex doesn't necessarily mean shit going into other shit. It literally means intimacy and emotional and cognitive connection and closeness with persons. That's still built into it. Very much so.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of shit going into other shit, have you heard of the Alaskan pipeline? I had to Google what that was. the name of that was.
I've heard of it. I've had to there's so many Urban Dictionary things. That was of the era of me being in middle school and high school and people talking about it.
Yeah.
At that point, I think Urban Dictionary is equivalent to what Cosmopolitan magazine was for a lot of us growing up, which is just, okay, let's put this together. And at this point, I'm like, just roll a fucking D20 and put 9 things together. And now you have a new term at this point.
Yeah.
But I think it's just the idea. And my Pollyanna version goes, everybody's so creative. The creativity of humans is astoundingly beautiful and simultaneously horrifying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
They exist together.
Yeah. Dovetails right with the whole Rule 34 thing too.
Yep.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yes. Someone showed me one Rule 34 from Tremors last night. It was a graboid.
Oh, of course.
In Rule 34. And I was like, no part of me is surprised. But good job. Good digital good digital work.
That's just flat out just going right down the vor community.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Which again is why that's just like with death. We talk about these things of what happens when someone passes or what happens when there's major stressors going on. Do we want to masturbate? Do we want to engage sexually when stuff, or are we aversive at that? What about after childbirth? What about after major, another mass shooting in the US happens? How do we respond? It just depends on what our individual relationships are and to not yuck other people. And simultaneously recognizing, why am I into this? Why are they into this? Why am I not into this? Why am I into this? And that constant self-reflection.
Always important to try to delve into the why.
There's a reason that I do a lot of what's called Socratic questioning. I identify as a cognitive behavioral therapist. And the funny joke is, this is why they killed Socrates, because he just they annoyed the shit out of everybody going, but why?
Pretty much literally why.
Yeah.
It's never escaping being that 5-year-old.
No, it's literally.
I try to embrace that. I want to always be that 5-year-old saying, why? But why? But why? But why?
Yep. Because it's always changing. And even in sexuality, we're going to see the changes in AI and virtual reality. And what about robots? And, in iRobot, as terrible of a movie as it actually is, they have sex robots, they have sex workers. And it's like, well, what about the rights of nothing's passed the Turing test yet. So what about conscientiousness and consciousness and consent with robots?
Yeah.
Are our vibrators going to start talking to us very a la South Park and the shake weight? What's going on, guys?
Oh, man. South Park is fantastic.
It is my favorite episode. I do not like South Park that much. I like Basketball way better than South Park, but the Food Network episode killed me. I was on the fucking floor.
I may have to look that one up. I can't think of it. And I also have a very fraught relationship with South Park. I always say that when it's on, it is fucking on.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, 90% of the time, it is not on.
Yeah. The Food Network episode is good. It is vetted by me as a psychologist. It is one of the funniest fucking episodes they have ever done. And I'm like, all right, you guys are good. Particularly if you watch any Food Network, you're going to be like, oh my God, the tropes.
It's been a while, but I did watch a lot of it growing up.
Then you'll be right on board.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me ask you about trauma, because I know you do have some specialization in trauma.
Yes, I do.
And we have talked in actually recent episodes about the way Goths deal with trauma and being subjected to trauma, sort of bullying, public bullying, abuse by parents, fear of violence, that kind of from partners or in general. And so sort of marrying that with the sex topic, I was interested in how trauma survivors, what advice you would have for setting boundaries and staying safe, and what experiences you might have in that arena.
And I love that you bring this up, because this is definitely one of the reasons I do what I do. Is my primary background is in working with trauma survivors, and that's of individuals who survived interpersonal violence. So that's things like sexual assault, rape, different sexually related interpersonal violence experiences, and combat trauma and bullying and everything. And I'm a very big advocate of trauma doesn't discriminate. We know that at least 80% of persons in their lifetime are going to experience at least one traumatic event. And we simultaneously know certain traumatic events can have a bigger psychological and physiological impact, things like interpersonal violence, things like combat. When we talk about the way the negative impact of trauma on sexual functioning, we're still exploring more and more about the intensity and the diversity of those impacts. And we know that they're very vast and they're very predominant, particularly for survivors of interpersonal violence. And simultaneously, there are phenomenal ways to overcome the negative impacts of trauma on sexual functioning. And that's where having a good relationship with your clinician, making sure that your clinician or seeing someone or talking to someone in your life that is informed is a huge, huge step, in someone that isn't going to negatively judge you for it. Particularly when we look at interpersonal violence, and bullying is in there, is the idea of being the survivor of a bully experience or the trauma of that, or domestic violence, even within family units. And I've seen that, unfortunately, quite a bit of people who identify as goth who got physically bullied, emotionally bullied by their peers, by their parents, by their siblings, even shame from teachers. It can impact us. It can impact a sexual relationship with the self, the idea of experience shame for who you are. Ways to overcome that are identifying, well, how credible was the source that was bullying you? And this is where, now that we're in our like 30s and 40s, we can reflect back on the people who bullied us. And I like to look at them occasionally and go, I'm glad you're ugly and just a terrible person. And I'm glad your hair is receding the way that it is, because you were just, and I recognize that's a very like surface level, but the idea of like, I'm glad you don't exist in my life anymore, and not letting them take up rent. But being able to
it's cathartic.
It's being able to approach identify what is the negative impact, what is continuing to motivate those negative responses, and what is my goal for change. And I think that's the mechanism that is almost the hardest, is what do we want your sexual functioning to look like? What do you actually want it to be? And being able to explore that before you're trying all these different positions and gritting your teeth or engaging in maybe not the most healthy or appropriate things towards yourself and others. I always like to kind of reverse engineer a little bit of, what do you want it to actually be like? And that's usually where I say start, but also I'm a big advocate of mental health. And if you have access to good clinicians and vetting clinicians, having someone who has a background in trauma recovery, because you can recover from trauma, even if it doesn't feel like it.
Right.
As long as you're here, you can recover.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think we're about ready to wrap up. Maybe I've got one more question here.
No, you're good. These are beautiful questions. I love being able to talk with both of you about them. Like, they're just, I can nerd out all day. That's why I'm like, there's so many things to say.
Yeah, there are. That's always the issue of like, what do I focus on? Do I want to just talk about one single thing for 45 minutes, or do we want to try and get through as many different subjects as possible, right? This may be more of an academic question, but stepping away for a moment from the sexual aspect of this, one of the interesting things I've noticed, specifically on TikTok, I think, is but obviously it's not specific to TikTok, but on TikTok, you do have these sort of like, the trope of the unqualified poster making videos about, here's a list of traits that might mean you have this disorder, and people kind of pathologizing themselves in that way. And
I just saw an autism bingo card.
Adult
autism bingo card, I believe it was.
Yeah, adult autism and adult ADHD bingo card.
Yep.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, if you think we spend too much, I guess this is a leading question, but if you think we spend too much time and focus on categorizing people into diagnoses, both in and out of academia.
And I'm so glad that you're asking this question, because this is something that I have like such an issue with TikTok on many, many reasons, but even just like social media. I'll kind of back up a little bit. When we talk about clinical diagnostics, in order for a diagnosis to exist, like actually from the clinical side, we have to have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of research participants. We have to have meta-analyses. We have to go through repeated randomized trials. We have to have task groups. It takes probably on average about 15 years worth of research in order for a diagnosis to actually exist. It has to be able to look at the comorbidities. What else might better account for it? Does this actually exist? So like on the clinical and academic side, it's the actual diagnoses have been researched and continue to be repeatedly researched to kind of get updates.
Mm-hmm.
And there's areas that when we look at who's funding the research and the contextual variables, and there's a lot of complexity that goes with a diagnosis existing for the most part. In order to diagnose, to actually be diagnosed, you have to go through intake processes, structured, semi-structured, and fully structured clinical interviews, assessment measures, a fuckload of stuff.
Mm.
In order to actually say, yes, you meet the criteria for this diagnosis and no other thing better accounts for your symptomology. You're talking anywhere between 10 to 50 hours worth of work embedded into just that case to go, yep, that probably makes sense. It's this. And the only people who can diagnose are mental health professionals. Like that is just how this works. Now, is it possible to have some traits of diagnostics and diagnoses? Yes, of course, all of us do, because the presence of symptoms does a diagnosis not meet. But most of us are going to have some symptoms of things. That's kind of what we would expect. So the big trend on like TikTok and like social media is if you have ... you might have autism. If you have ... you might have this. Maybe. But also, what if it's this? What if it's this? What if it's then? That's where you get into diagnostician work. That's something I do. Now, academically, we're looking at most of the research you're looking at is very intensive. It takes years and years and years to do. But reading something on social media is going to be like, oh, I have this.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
What about it, though, is matching for you? And we run into a huge issue on social media of the Barnum effect. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wait, yes. For those of you not as familiar with the Barnum effect, this is literally why astrological signs exist and why the Myers-Briggs exists. Yep. It is generalized statements that are so vague that they basically encompass most people. And that is kind of the trend, unfortunately, I'm noticing of like those unqualified posters and social media persons being like, here's 5 things. Do you have them? You might have this. No, that means that you're human and you have a fully functioning frontal lobe. That means you probably have those things.
Yeah.
That's pretty universal.
Yeah, it's kind of the also sort of like pareidolia, the
pattern
finding patterns and random stuff. Yeah,
it's a glitch in the matrix.
Yeah,
but I think like when we rely from a clinical standpoint, do we rely too heavy on these? Yes and no. I lean more no, because it takes actually quite a lot for a person to be diagnosed. And in the US, do we rely on them for clinicians who accept insurance? Yeah, because they don't get paid for it otherwise. And that's why I have like general codes, kind of like unspecified anxiety disorder, unspecified depressive disorder kind of comes into play to go, hey, something's going on. I'm not sure, but we're going to do that together. And the insurance company doesn't need to know all of the shit that's going on because they're not in the room.
But then started about fucking insurance companies.
Oh yeah. I mean, well, you're going to deal with like, it's
non-medical professionals making assessments on what actual medical procedures one needs or doesn't need.
But that's where I do look at it from like an international standpoint too. We're looking at, and that's where some of the diagnoses do exist, that they are present cross-culturally. And that is something that I think is very important, because we've got international studies that have found, wow, this is like a very human thing we see in this population, regardless of someone's background, regardless of the generation in which they were born. We just happen to understand it and have a better name for it. PTSD is a good example of it. We used to call PTSD soldiers heart, like wounded heart, or like shell shock. Yeah, it was shell shock back in from the World War I, World War II. And it's always been there. We just understand it more. We have a different viewpoint of it. We see this a lot with like neurodivergence and autism. Are people saying, oh, there's an increased rate of autism? Actually, no, we just are grabbing we're able to identify and diagnose it earlier, but the rates are pretty equivalent. We're actually able to provide primary intervention and early intervention for these individuals. It's not that that's happening at increased rate. We're just paying more attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to automatically change our perception of its occurrence rate.
Right. Which we're struggling with right now with the whole transgender debate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Trans people have been around for a very, 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 very long time. This ain't new, y'all. This ain't new.
They've been written into Greek stories from ancient times and probably before.
Ain't new. Yeah, this ain't new. And it's a very, again, two-spirited in Native American culture. Yep. We look at what's going on in the Fijian culture. Yeah, this ain't new, y'all. But it's new to some people. And I think that's the biggest struggle is going, is this, why are we hearing about this more? It's like, because we're actually talking about it more. And there's increased legislation built that's going to, in some states, that's going to protect people who talk about trans rights, who aren't going to discriminate. So that automatically means that they're going to have a space that they can talk about these things because they ordinarily haven't been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess being safer from institutional violence and oppression allows people to explore themselves and ask those questions more. Whereas in the past, that wouldn't have been an option. Or if you suspected something about yourself, it still wasn't an option because you were afraid of being, a victim of violence.
There's retaliation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Killed or actually legally imprisoned because of deviant behavior is something that makes the expression of that seem a lot more rare.
Mm-hmm. And this is where I've done so much work in the veteran community. The amount of veterans that we have that are trans is actually exceedingly high. And one of the reasons for that is if you identify as a trans woman, but you're not in a space that you feel safe enough to be able to explore these things, what is the most masculine thing you can do to try to push that shit down?
Yeah.
You join the military, you join the police force.
Right.
It's because of that stage of development. And this is what I love about people as we get older. We stop giving as many shits.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can find communities that we feel safe to express ourselves, that's the beauty in it. And I think that's even within goth culture. As we get older, the older goths are some of my favorite humans, is you see the level of I don't give a fuck and I still am aware of you and want you to be okay, but I'm not going to filter my life for you.
Nor do I need you to filter your life towards me to fit my conception that makes me comfortable in my position.
Exactly. And that is the genuine humanity of it all.
Yeah. And I think that's a beautiful way to end the episode. Although I will ask, I do usually like to try and give some space. If there was something you did want to get out there or subject you did want to talk about, you could give you the space to bring that up if there's something I missed maybe. But
no, I think we did a wonderful job. Again, this is something that has so many different pieces connected to it. I appreciate being able to shit talk TikTok because I have lots of issues with TikTok and the policing that comes along with it and the misinformation and like the prime, it's just a lot of issues. But just because you see something on TikTok doesn't make it true. And the fact that it is prompting a thought in you is awesome. So kind of that.
Yes, explore that. Yeah, don't and because the issue with TikTok is it will, I guess the modality itself is this sort of like constant stream of information switching from one thing to another, and I try myself to think if there is a strong emotion triggered, or especially if it's something that I agree with, I'm like, oh yeah, that confirms something I already thought. Try and stop and take a minute and actually explore that rather than just moving on. Sort of the critical thinking aspect of that again, next to like sex education is woefully lacking in the public. Yeah.
Very much so. And also TikTok, note that TikTok polices a lot. And I apologize for using the term repeatedly, but they tend to monitor and take down and remove some content, but not others. So there's a huge, vast chasm of information that is not able to be discussed on a platform that doesn't have age restriction, which I'm the first one to say, like, I'm a very big advocate of, we should totally engage in sex education across the lifespan and developmentally appropriate at all times.
Yeah.
Which I'm not going to explain sex ed to a 25-year-old the way I explain it to a 5-year-old. Those are different conversations. I'm not going to say pussy to a 5-year-old. I'm going to say it to a 25-year-old, but not to a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
And that's really where I wish TikTok had age restriction, but I also recognize why they don't.
Sure. And I mean, it's also, go ahead, Trey.
I was going to say to dovetail with this discussion, and maybe I'll let you ask your question first, but I was wanting to see if you had any recommendations for either for resources for the modern era, because obviously our bodies, ourselves, and good vibrations, old print media that were stalwarts aren't as engaging with modern people coming up and exploring their own sexuality any longer. So they do go to TikTok, they do go to YouTube, they do go to whatever. Do you have recommendations of individuals to follow in these platforms that do have good information and avoid some of the, autism bingo cards or weird urban myths about sexuality and gender and things like that?
Oh, yes, I do. So I'll definitely do like a shameless plug for myself.
Of course.
So my social media, I try to do that a bit. I adore queer sex therapy on Instagram. They do a wonderful, wonderful job talking about queer related concerns. If you follow Division 44 of the APA, which is human sexuality and LGBTQ plus population, it talks a lot about that. ASECT has AASECT has some really great resources. I also highly recommend following Dr. Ruth's Twitter. She is a hoot and a half, and I just love that woman so very, very much. So there are some. Dr. Stephanie Bueller is phenomenal. Dr. Stephanie Golarick is wonderful. Like, there are definitely quite a few. My big recommendation is if you find someone on social media that you're like, ooh, I like their stuff, I like their content, look at what their credentials are. The acronyms behind their name. Where did they go to school? What's their website? Do they have a license number? What makes them credible? Like, and this is where I like rage about Jordan Peterson. That person is a Canadian psychologist, so they're not meeting current APA standards. Looking at their background, looking at what their research is, you start to dissect and digest a little bit, going, wow, this person doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about.
No, absolutely not.
That's where you become you become more of an informed consumer. So I'm a very big advocate of, I don't put stuff on social media that I just pulled out of my ass. Most of my anxiety is like, don't say the thing, because you want to make sure you've done all of the research and all of the things, which is why I almost get like freeze responses with social media. But look at someone's credentials, look at their patterns, look at how they're communicating about things, and also look at if they are being funded by anyone else or sponsored by anyone else, because that's going to dictate things a lot too.
Yeah.
Apologies for the long-winded answer on that.
No, that's all right. Good. No, one of the ones that I gravitated to.
Let me just make a joke.
Yeah.
Can I make a joke, please?
No.
It's not going to be funny anymore. But in stark contrast, I love talking about things I pull out of my ass. Okay, you may go ahead now.
Exactly.
Now you can cut that in post to get the timing right, though. So you'll fix it. But one of the people I've gone to for a long time, though she's not as commonly, is Dr. Lindsay Doe. On the Sexplanation YouTube
Sexplanations. I wish she posted more.
She started up a little bit more.
She started up a little bit more, but I love.
Yeah, she really backed away from the community for quite a while. And another one I like, who is not accredited, but usually gives that caveat all over the place because she's not a doctor, but Hannah Witten is a YouTuber out of Britain. That's more of a personal dialogue about her own experience with sexuality, and she'll usually always give that caveat. But I find her content really very interesting.
Yes. Lacey Green did stuff for years and years and years.
Good too. I haven't seen her in a long time.
I remember watching one of her videos when she kind of like did an update. Is she was going back to school for a doctorate program?
She got slammed by.
But then she got slammed because all of the stuff that had gone on back in the day.
She got totally mauled with Gamergate, and that was, I think that's where she just totally pulled back and like, I'm done with this whole thing. Yeah.
I will say, if you would love, this is not a sexual health person, but one of my favorite YouTubers is Sophia Nygaard, who I just am so in love with so very, very much. And she identifies as Gothic, and she's a hoot. I love her so much. I love Sophia. She was with BuzzFeed for a very, very long time. But she does really interesting, like just funny shenanigans of like mixing all of Sephora's makeups together or trying different period products. And I really just love Sophia. And I've seen her.
I just found her.
I love Sophia. And she's someone I think is a very good example of, for our younger population of like early goths. I think she's a very healthy example, and she's very funny.
What was her last name?
Sophia Nygaard,
Nygaard.
Okay. Well, to that point, I do want to ask, because you mentioned it briefly, but specifically, what platforms and under what @s can people find you online to follow all your stuff?
Yes. So I tried to keep it easy for everyone. So it's Dr. Jordan Soper, Soper, on literally every single platform. Trying to make it easy. I have an Instagram, a Facebook, a TikTok. I very rarely use Twitter, and I refuse to call it X because it'll always be Twitter. Thank you, Elon. And then I do have a YouTube channel that I am starting a little bit more just because I'm learning to do more media, like video editing things. But I do like to rage about Cosmo when I can, and TikTok does not take things down. But Instagram tends to be a little bit better. I also cosplay. So that's a fun fact. On most of my social media, you'll see sex education and mental health education facts. And then you'll probably see a bunch of random dress ups that do happen as well.
Which and those two things can go together as well.
They do. I'm a big fan of intersectionality. I will always be a giant metalhead, but I love Lady Gaga. I love
Lady Gaga too.
I love Gaga, like the intersectionality. My boy band was Savage Garden growing up.
Excellent.
So there's a lot I love the idea of being one thing doesn't mean you have to exclude others. It's not one pie tin. It's an insurmountable amount of pie tins.
You're preaching to the choir. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'll have links to all of those in the show notes as well for anyone who wants to just click it and go and follow. Please do that. But yeah, Jordan, thank you so much. This was, I loved speaking with you. You're very insightful, and it was really a pleasure. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you so very much to both of you. I appreciate it so much. And these are awesome. I love the intersectionality conversations we're able to have.
It's spooky season, and we're here on the front lines of the war on Halloween, creeping it real, dodging the neon celebrations of Ken and Barbie with the side of the occasional, hey, I like your costume. And, of course, binge-watching Elvira movie marathons while folks are out there in the streets getting in fistfights outside of Five Nights at Freddy's. Sure, Halloween is over, or I'm assuming it's over because I'm recording this before Halloween, but I want you to meet two bands who are keeping everyday Halloween while speaking to the most vulnerable parts of ourselves. I am Azzy, practicing my segue skills, and you're listening to All Goth Considered with Obscure Undead. First up is a name some of you longtime listeners of OU might remember from back when we were doing Subculture Shock and Tales from the Goth Side. Hailing from Texas is post-punk / death rock band Blood Bells, fronted by Clint Jerome on vocals, Lauren Williamson Jerome on bass, and Ryan Pogue on drums. If you're a fan of Killing Joke and Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry, you might just be a Blood Bells fan and you don't know it yet. They haven't put out a release since their fabulous debut, A Time for Roses, back in 2018. So give it up for Clint, who is here to tell us about their upcoming album, Wrong Side, and its lead titular single, Wrong Side.
Greetings, this is your fellow partner in crime, Clint, from the band Blood Bells. I got my start in the early 2000s, cutting my teeth as a drummer in punk bands, and after several years of drumming, I switched over to guitar and vocals and started a 70s-style punk band that rode me through a few years, and after a few years of doing that, I just was ready to finally play the music that I'd always wanted to play and start the kind of band I always wanted to start, which was like a death rock, post-punk, gothic rock type band, as that has been the predominant genre that I have adored next to 80s new wave since the late 90s. So enter Blood Bells, starting in 2015. We've had a few incarnations since then. We had a personnel change a few years ago, and my wonderful partner and spouse, Lauren, has joined up on bass, and we've got a live drummer instead of a drum machine now, Ryan. He actually was with me in my last punk band as well. And I'm really excited about this new record that we've got coming out called Wrong Side. It's been recorded by Michael Briggs at Civil Audio here in Denton, Texas. And we wanted a much, much larger and polished sound on this album, considering how lo-fi A Time for Roses was. And you will find we're actually going to have a couple of re-recordings of songs from that first record on this one, along with, I believe, 5 new ones. One of which is a song called Wrong Side, which we release on October 1st. It is the titular track for the, we'll say mini album, because it's really only going to have 7 songs on it. And we decided this would be a really good one to kind of usher our potential new fan base, as well as bring our supporters that we've had since the beginning into our new era of, kind of really wanting to see how far we can stretch this and how good we can make it. And the song Wrong Side is a song about that I actually wrote a few years ago, and we finally had a chance to kind of compose it. And it's about addiction and struggles with things of that nature. Honestly, it's about just waiting for the moment that you can get your fix, no matter what's happening. Many of us have struggled with these kind of addictions, from alcohol to harder drugs, and even things that aren't necessarily a narcotic, but are natural inclinations and vices. And I wanted to convey the frustration and the desperation that comes along with these said vices in the song Wrong Side. So I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for listening.
up is Canadian solo artist Jason Schatzel and his brand new to our spooky party band, Gothnetic. Jason, also known by stage name War Druid, has been a drummer and songwriter for black metal band Havengrave. And while he self-describes his music as gothic metal over on their YouTube, the band has a heavier goth rock styling without the screaming power chords that I think anyone who enjoys gothic rock bands like Miasma or the 69 Eyes will find particularly enticing. Gothnetic's debut album released Halloween, and hey, I want to tell you all about their leading single, The Darkness Calls. I really do, but honestly, Jason says it better.
Greetings, this is Jason from Gothnetic. I'd like to thank Azzy for this opportunity. It means a lot from an underground artist. The Darkness Calls was one of the newest singles that was released recently. Funny thing how music writing works. On this song, I was at my job working. I had a vision of a video with somewhat of an idea even before the song was made. So with this idea in my head, I was picturing the video in the back of my head while I was multitasking all this info. I wrote the riffs and it came to me just like that. The song's about the pain a person holds inside, struggles with some sort of addiction or mental depression. In the lyrics, in the shadows you hide again, escaping this world of sin, feeling different in your skin, the emotions flood within, meaning hiding away from society, keeping in your own issues, trying to fit in this molded world, hoping not to get hurt from others. Better to be in solitude without judgment that might hurt you more. In the lyrics, in the shadows you drink again, escaping this world of pain, feeling lost with emptiness again, a vicious circle with no end, meaning addiction, in this case drinking to drown the sorrows and numb the pain, trying to feel something even when you know the next day will cause anxiety, living the moment, not caring for the consequences. This song is related in different ways to others, and I hope even just one person hears the song that can relate to this. I hope you enjoy The Darkness Calls, and thank you, Azzy, to make this possible and open a door for Gothnetic as a new, fresh band.
In the shadows you hide again, escaping
Thanks for listening, friend bats. Go check out Blood Bells and Gothnetic and show them some love. If you happen to know someone who needs to be on my radar, have them drop me a line at obscureundead@gmail.com. All right, I'm out. Take care. Love you. Bye-bye.
Azzy and Jordan, thank you both so much for contributing and coming on to this episode. And not that it matters that much, but I apologize for my voice. I'm getting over a cold that kind of fucked up my throat, and it is what it is, right? So I have a little bit of information about the upcoming episode and the end of the year. So as you may know, next month will be our final episode of the year. And then in January, we take a hiatus. So the new episode won't be coming out until February. And during that time, we take some time to relax, recuperate, celebrate some birthdays and holidays, and plan for the coming year, as well as host a hangout for the Patreons. That is always a wonderful time to get to spend a few hours having a conversation and just relaxing with the Patreon members and all you wonderful supporters. Next month, I will actually not be on the podcast. So as I talked a bit about at the end of a previous episode, life has been extremely difficult for myself and my family this year. And the last month, this month of October, has actually been the most difficult we've ever experienced, with a number of health emergencies and chronic issues and financial problems. I have been pushed to my limit, and my burnout has culminated in a crash, essentially. So my dear friends Azzy, Ryan, and Trey have offered to put together and record next month's episode. And I trust them, and I am very grateful for their support. And so I'll be editing the episode and publishing it, but I won't be involved with anything else. And so that will also provide me with a much needed little bit of respite to sort of catch up on life. I won't go into the details because it's who wants to hear all that nonsense, but it is much needed and much appreciated. And then we will be returning with our next episode and beginning a whole new year of podcasts and guests and interviews, which I'm very, very excited about. So thank you for coming on this journey with me. Thank you for supporting and enjoying and appreciating this show for the length of 2024. I always worry that each new year will be the last year I'll be able to do this, but I am humbled and appreciative that I'm able to provide the goth community with entertainment and a resource in whatever small way that I can. So here's my plug. If you'd like to support the show, if you'd like to hang out with all the Patreon members in January, head over to patreon.com/cemeteryconfessions, and you can join for as little as $1, which will get you access to our Discord server and early access to episodes as well. So thank you again so much for spending your time with us, and until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.